Well, hello again, friends. Welcome to a whole new year, 2014, a new podcast, my first one of the year. Sorry for the slackness on my part, gotten behind doing the podcasting, but so many former students and current students have been hitting me up saying, "Yo, Boyer, what's up with Ukraine?" Yeah, it's been the top news story for weeks now on the world stage, months for those of us that follow it. It is a really big deal. It has gotten violent and it has caused, right now in its semi-end game, the dismissal of a democratically elected leader. So it's kind of a big deal. And you know what? For you students of mine, you know that it's bigger than just a current event. This is a battle for the heart and soul of this country and possibly the last battle of the Cold War. This is an ideological battle within the country, but also between Russia and Team West. So this is a much bigger deal than even just the bloody events within the country itself. This is so complicated, in fact, that maybe, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, maybe we'll do a three-part podcast series starting right this second. And let's start with the background. What has led up to the current bloodshed, debacle, and dismissal of a democratically elected president in Ukraine? That'll be what we do today. Then we'll do another podcast tomorrow on, okay, what were the actual events that lit this fuse and what all happened and who are the players in the game now? And then, and of course probably the most intriguing, let's do the third part on what are the repercussions for Ukraine? What is its possible future path? What's the Russian role here? What are the impacts that Russia can have and the impacts on Russia? And of course we'll always have to tie in and Team West. Since we've now alluded to the fact that this Ukrainian situation is a much broader regional tussle, what's going to be the future for all the players involved? How about that for a three-part series? Well, let's go with part one then. What is the real background here that's led up to the Ukraine blowing up internally with some help from the outside just in the last few weeks? This is a country, and boom, there it is, that has historically been a part of Russia. On again, off again for most of the last few hundred years. This place, this entity, this sovereign state that we call Ukraine, in today's world, has been part of Russia, part of the Russian Empire outright at different times. And during the Soviet era, which this is a beautiful old classic map I have hanging in my office here, the Ukraine was the Ukrainian SSR, that is a satellite state within the greater USSR. It only gained its full independence in the shape of the modern state that we recognize in today's world as Ukraine back in 1991 when the Soviet Union imploded. And they said, okay, well, all of the sub-states who perhaps want their independence, go ahead and vote for your independence if you want to be independent. If not, you can stay as part of Russia. And 14 states bailed. Right? Now, again, most of you know this from class. So back in 1991, Soviet Union goes away. 15 new states were created from its ashes, Russia being one, but all those other states around it being the other 14, namely Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. Back to Ukraine. I do want people to note, and this is oft overlooked by the press, and I have been watching the coverage of the Ukrainian situation from a variety of press sources, but everybody has kind of forgotten this little fact. While there has been this big divide in the country, and there is pro-Western forces battling it out against pro-Russian forces within Ukraine, what has been forgotten is that in 1991, overwhelmingly, everybody in the state that's now called Ukraine voted to be independent of Russia, voted themselves out of the USSR. By an overwhelming majority, pro-Russia people, pro-Western people, pro-everybody people within Ukraine said, no, we want to be our own separate state. So right from the get-go, you need to get that even though there are some elements of Russian ethnicity and Russian language and Russian society within Ukraine, even those people voted to be different, a separate state, a separate entity from Mother Russia. Okay, now let's get to those pro-Russian people, because that is what mostly the press has been magnifying. And it is worth noting, I'm not making fun of the press, that Ukraine is, in today's world and in 1991, a semi-divided state. They all voted for independence, but semi-divided in their demographic makeup. And what I mean by that is that about half the state is a kind of pro-Russian, speaks Russian as a first language, and can even trace themselves and would identify themselves as ethnically Russian. Now, the state's called Ukraine, so the other half of Ukraine are people that would self-identify themselves ethnically as Ukrainian, that would speak Ukrainian as a first language, and would say, well, we don't really have any dear love of Mother Russia. In fact, we maybe want to pair up or partner up with more Western elements, like the Europeans. And that's the crux of what's going on here. You have a divided state internally. Before we even bother with outside forces meddling in Ukraine, the Ukrainians themselves are a bit divided. Now, what's the exact percentages? I don't know. Does it even matter? Really, do hardcore facts matter all the time? It's the sentiment and the spirit of what's going on here is what's important. But I'll try at some facts. So some of the statistics I've heard is that 30, 35, maybe 40% of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language. 40 seems high. I say 30 to 35%. About a third of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language, and about that same third would identify themselves as ethnically Russian. The flip side is everybody else. So somewhere between 50 and 55% of the rest of Ukraine speaks Ukrainian as a first language and would identify themselves as ethnically Ukrainian. Again, these are just rough figures, but it's important to understand this. Other point to note, I think, and I'm not swearing to this, but I would think that probably everyone in the state of Ukraine speaks Ukrainian. So even the ones who speak Russian as a first language probably also speak Ukrainians. And I'm also pretty sure that many Ukrainians who would identify themselves as Ukrainians ethnically and speak Ukrainian as a first language probably speak Russian as a second language. So this portrait being painted as a divided society where no one can even communicate with each other and they all hate each other, no, that's taking it too far. Okay, so you have this entity, this geographic entity, that has been on again, off again, part of Russia. Obviously, when it was part of the USSR, the Russians, which have always been in charge, or were in charge of the USSR, the dominant political, economic, and ethnic group of the USSR was Russian people. So whenever they had these other states as a part of their USSR, of course the Russians encouraged immigration, ethnic Russian immigration to Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Estonia. And therefore Russian culture permeated into Ukraine just like it had for hundreds of years before. So it's not a surprise, by the way. This isn't some nefarious Russian scheme to take over Ukraine. This is history, man. This is history over hundreds of years kind of playing itself out that yes, there's a whole lot of Russianness within Ukraine. There's some in Kazakhstan too and some in Estonia. So this is not that surprising. Okay. That's kind of the classic old part of the background of how Ukraine has got to where it is today. So in 1991, it becomes its own independent state that does have peoples within it of different ethnicities and different languages, although everybody can communicate with everybody, and everybody voted for independence. That's kind of part one, step one here. Everybody with me so far? So how did it start to go bad then? Okay. Well, like so many other Eastern European states and newer states around the planet, they've not had a lot of very good political leadership. I think you have to point at that as number one. Corruption has been endemic in Ukrainian society. It still is. So it really doesn't even matter who's been in charge. Nobody's done that good of a job since 1991. But how would that accentuate the divide between these peoples? Oh, by the way, let me add this other geo-fact, which maybe doesn't even need to be spoken, but let's speak it. Where are the ethnically Russian people in Ukraine and the ones who speak Russian as a first language, surprise, surprise, they're on the eastern side of Ukraine, the side that's closest to Russia. Geography is awesome. Where are the people that self-identify themselves ethnically as Ukrainian and don't really want to have ties with Russia and maybe or maybe not speak Russian as a second language and want to be more pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-European? That would be the western side of the state. It really is kind of nicely divided to understand it. So the western part of Ukraine is pro-West. The eastern part of Ukraine is pro-Russia. It's quite simple. And by the way, let me see if I can remember to put in a couple of maps here. This plays itself out in maps of the linguistic division I've referenced. It also plays itself out in voting patterns. So you have had political parties across Ukraine. And by the way, this is a country of like 45 or 46 million people. This is a big country geographically, and it's got a big population. That's why it's important. And they've had different political parties from different sides of the state. Some political parties are pro-Russian. Some are pro-European. Surprise! And that's where the internal battle has really started to play itself out. Political parties who have said, we want to align our state back with Mother Russia, or we want to align our state over with the Europeans and the Americans. That's where the friction comes in. And again, for those that know what's been going on in Ukraine, this is not a great surprise. The events of the last month or 2 months or 3 months aren't even a surprise. This has been going on for a decade. Now let me finish up the prehistory to the current events so you understand everything completely. This idea that there's a pro-Russian political factions and pro-European political faction and they're going to duke it out for control of Ukraine, that's not new. It's been going on since 1991, and they went through about a decade where the country just kept sliding downhill under poor leadership. Didn't matter whose political party was in charge, although I believe at the time it was more dominated by the pro-Russian political parties. But what's critical in understanding the backstory here is the election of 2004. And in 2004, and here's where it gets more hilarious because the press has also completely forgotten this and fails to bring it up. They had a political election in 2004 for president, okay? They have a presidential terms of 5 years. So the election was in 2004 for the new president to come in 2005, and they served 5-year terms. This will come back up with the 2010 election. Hang on. So in 2004, they were having an election for president. Surprise, surprise. There was a pro-Russia candidate who wanted to align the state more with Russia. There was a pro-Western candidate who wanted to align the state with the European Union and the Europeans and the Americans and all things West. Surprise! No, it's not. That's what's been going on for 20 years. Okay, well, who was running against who? This is where it gets crazy. Okay, so the pro-European guy was named Viktor Yushchenko. Let's call him Victor Y. Yushchenko. He was running against the pro-Russian candidate, who was Viktor Yanukovych, also Victor Y. So it was Victor Y against Victor Y in the 2004 Ukrainian election. Why ask why? Who knows? They're all Y names. Okay, TV timeout, TV timeout. I got to go in and fast forward because this will help you understand the situation, and all the press keeps forgetting this. Who was the pro-Russian candidate in 2004, who, by the way, won the election? I just said his name was Victor Y. Victor Yanukovych. If you've been following the news at all, you know that's the same Victor Yanukovych who just got kicked out of office that the country's been protesting about for a month. So this guy actually ran for president. The current president, well, I should say, kind of the currentist president who just got thrown out of office 48 hours ago, Victor Yanukovych, is the same Victor Yanukovych who ran for president in 2004. Now let's go back and finish the 2004 story. Okay, he won. Victor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, won the presidential election by about that much. And immediately people said this election was rigged. There was too much Russian influence and Russian money in here. The Russians are playing too heavy a hand in here. The ballot boxes were stuffed. This is rigged. People went to the street and said, no, we know enough of us, pro-Western people voted. There's no way in hell Victor Yanukovych won. And enough people came out and enough people protested it that it turned into a revolution. Go Google Orange Revolution of 2004. This is the start. If you want to know what's going on now, you got to go back to 2004 because that's where it starts. When the Orange Revolution happened, it was a peaceful revolution. That's what's so awesome about it. And it also shows that the Ukrainians are no strangers to revolution. So in 2004, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street to protest the election result. It was countrywide, but mostly based in the West, in Kiev, the capital. And after enough pressure internally and internationally, Ukraine said, the Ukraine Supreme Court, I believe, said, okay, do over. Let's do the election over then. Pull in international observers. They did the election over again, I think very quickly, like within a month or two. And lo and behold, the pro-Western guy won the redo of the election. The pro-Russian guy, let's name him again, Viktor Yanukovych, who had won, but had done it crookedly, and so was thrown out. He went away. Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Western, I want to get Ukraine into the EU, Yushchenko, was president. He immediately made his prime minister one Yulia Tymoshenko. I know I'm throwing a lot of Enkos at you here. She's important because she just got released from prison yesterday. So Yulia Tymoshenko, one of the more hilarious hottie world leaders because she's got these awesome Princess Leia braids in her hair. Google her too. She was prime minister, actually served 2 different terms as prime minister under the Viktor Yushchenko government, the pro-Western Yushchenko government. Okay, why have I given you all these names, numbers, and places and stuff? Well, here's why. Because the pro-Western group was in power from 2005 to 2010, and they failed miserably. Failed miserably. Viktor Yushchenko, you don't even hear his name being mentioned anymore. By the way, there's a great backstory to him being poisoned by the KGB. Go look him up too if you want to read that story. So the pro-Western group that had power for 5 years, they ended up, I don't know if corruption was as bad, but they just failed to do anything. The Ukrainian economy continued to slide. I mean, it's in the toilet. Their relations with Russia were bad at the time, so the Russians would raise the price of oil and natural gas, which Ukraine gets all of their oil and natural gas from Russia. So the Russians were applying pressure. Economically, they were not doing well. Unemployment was rising. Crime was rising. The promise of teaming up with the Europeans never materialized. It was just a debacle. I mean, and these guys were pro-European, pro-Western. It pains me to make fun of them, but they achieved nothing in 5 years, nothing. And that's why people got all pissed off about it. So, again, fast forward now. Now we're 2010. Next presidential election. Who's running? A pro-EU, pro-European candidate who wants Ukraine to join Europe. And gosh, what was her name? Her name was Yulia Tymoshenko. And she was running against a pro-Russian, wants to unify the country more with Russia candidate. What was his name? Viktor Yanukovych. Boom, boom, boom. You see how following history every now and again actually makes understanding the modern world quite easy. So lo and behold, you know the backstory now. The pro-Western folks had a 5-year run at it after the Orange Revolution, and they sucked. So the mood in the country was, no, let the other team have a chance. The pro-Russian eastern side of the country came out in droves to vote, and a lot of folks, even in the West, said, no, the pro-Western, pro-EU people messed up, so yeah, we're going to vote for Yanukovych. By all international standards, the election of 2010 was free and fair, and lo and behold, pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych won the presidency in 2010. That's how he got into office. That's the guy that's been in there for the last 4 years. That's the dude that started all the trouble that ended in bloodshed just last week. And that's the guy who just got ejected, dismissed out of his democratically elected position less than 48 hours ago. Does that give you enough backstory now? Of course, why did he get kicked out? Because the pro-Western, pro-European peoples in Western Ukraine had enough of his corruption, because under his last 4 years, the country's done even worse, and it's gotten more corrupt, and billions have been stolen from the government coffers, and him and all of his buddies have been enriched. And when the European Union was extending an invitation, not even an invitation to join, but an invitation to work with Ukraine and start the process of getting Ukraine in the EU, President Viktor Yanukovych, pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych said, no, we don't want to do that. We're going to throw in our lot and our future with Russia. That's what started everything. But stop! I've gotten ahead of myself. I said I was going to make a 3-part series. That's part 2. So let's stop here and pick up there with the next podcast on what happened to the Ukraine in the last few months that, kaboom, made it blow up.